I'm David Pringle. I'm the moderator for today's webinar. So this is an online workshop, and it's a product of Science Business's Data Rules group, which is run by a steering committee representing some leading companies and academic institutions, as well as the OECD. This workshop in particular is going to explore the data and artificial intelligence imbalances between different regions of the world and the implications of that for research, innovation, and socio-economic development. Hopefully, we're going to actually identify some concrete actions that Europe can take to reduce the global data divide. So obviously, artificial intelligence has been widely hyped, and for good reason, because data analytics and AI are sort of key enablers now of our increasingly digital economy. We've got computers recognizing faces, transcribing and translating text, making recommendations, anticipating component failures, and even potentially driving vehicles in future. So better data and better software are driving advances in almost all fields of research, from the development of new medical treatments to the tracking and the progress of climate change. So we've got so many potential applications for consumers, businesses, and scientists. So AI tools could potentially become as widely used and as indispensable as electricity. So pretty profound for the global development. Yet it's clear that some countries are much further ahead than others. And in the private sector, we know that the world's leading exponents of AI are essentially based in the US and China, while some of Europe's universities can also claim to be at the cutting edge of this technology. One great example was the acclaimed AI startup DeepMind, which was acquired by Google in 2014, and that was founded by researchers from the University College London. So the developed world is pursuing this field with some vigor, but what about the global south, which is really the topic of today's webinar? And are we seeing a dangerous data divide open up between the highly digitized developed economies and much of Africa, Latin America, and South Asia, where both connectivity and computing power remain somewhat scarce? So the social economic implications of this divide could potentially exacerbate existing inequalities and fuel even some global instability. So in this webinar, we're going to explore this topic in two segments with lead speakers in each segment, and we'll leave some time for audience Q&A as well. Now you can ask those questions via the chat, or I think members of our steering committee could actually turn on their camera and post questions directly. As I mentioned, the webinar is recorded and it's on the record. And we're going to publish the recording of the webinar after the event and distribute that widely. And we'll also publish an article summarizing the key takeaways. So I'll ask all the speakers to stay on mute unless they're actually speaking, but to keep their cameras on when they're actually in when the segment in which they're leading is taking place. So I'm going to ask each of the lead speakers to make some opening remarks, 3 to 4 minutes, to introduce themselves and how their work relates to this field. And then following the opening remarks, we'll have a panel discussion to get a little bit deeper into some of these issues. So the first segment is understanding the AI data divide. What does it look like, and what are the social economic implications? We've got 4 great speakers on this. We've got Professor Nicholas van Zeebroek of the Solvay Brussels School. We've got Dr. Teresa Scantamburlo from the European Centre for Living Technology, the University of Venice. Dr. Atia Cortes of the Barcelona Supercomputing Center, and Audrey Plonk of the OECD. So thank you to all of them in advance for joining us and for their insights. So I'm going to start by turning the floor over to Nicholas to set the scene, and then we'll go to each of the other speakers in turn. So Nicholas, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you all. It's a great pleasure to be here with you, well, virtually, which is already something. So yes, I'd like to just a couple of minutes to share with you some high-level reflections on the topic. And I'd like, if you allow me, to start from a broader perspective, which is digitalization beyond just AI and data, which of course are part of a broader game. That I think is useful because if you look at what digitalization has done and how it has unfolded over the past few years, or I should say 1 or 2 decades, you see three contradicting effects. For one, clearly, new digital technologies are creating new opportunities that are actually leveraged by reinventors, disruptors, leapfroggers, call them whoever you want. That means by actually outsiders. And that could include also outsiders from developing economies, potentially. On the contrary, technology is also cumulative, which means that there's benefit to capitalizing on earlier generations of the technology. And that, of course, is going to favor those who can invest in the long run in the technology. And related to that, we see growing profit accumulation and the rise of what is sometimes referred to as superstar firms, which you could extend at to some extent to superstar countries, which are those few firms or regions or countries that really seem to reap off most of the benefits from digitalization. And there's a paradox there, because technology should be, and that actually is really in line with the original vision of the internet. This was supposed to be the democratizing technology above all, the thing that should put everybody on a par with equal access to knowledge, with equal access to low transaction costs and stuff like that. What we see is that it has created many imbalances, suggesting that the profit and technology accumulation effect dominates the sort of new opportunities for innovation one. And unfortunately, we see evidence of that pretty much everywhere. In Europe, for instance, where we've conducted a number of recent studies for the Commission on the adoption of digital technology in general and AI in particular across European countries, we see somehow already a pattern emerging where northwestern countries in Europe are far more advanced than most countries in the south and east. And so we see that on a global scale as well. Quite obviously, the technology is, of course, adapted a lot more in those western and northern countries than in the south, and that seems to be accelerating to some extent. So that is of course concerning. Now the question is, why is this happening? One of the reasons I believe is what I mentioned already, this idea of technology accumulation that makes it so that those enjoying already the digital foundations or the foundations from the previous generations are faster at adapting the new ones. And that's typically the case for AI and data and analytics in general. To be specific here, in order to leverage AI and data, you of course need data, but you also need processes to generate the data and to act on the insights. You need the right skills, the right culture, the right infrastructure, the right software in place, etc. And so, of course, there's a benefit, there's an advantage for those who have already built up all of the underlying stacks of technology and skills that are required. Another element which is worrisome is the fact that ecosystems and network effects clearly favor the accumulation of data and by extension profits. And that results in the obvious patterns of those superstar technology firms that are really benefiting from those network effects in the ecosystems that they've built. And that's kind of scary, because that means that increasingly the value is actually captured by those ecosystems which are global by design and by ambition, and then the payoffs can be very important. Yeah. Now the question is whether the gap is widening and whether this is a fatality. Again, there are two antagonistic forces here. One is the leapfrogging question on the demand side, where you see that some southern countries are actually faster than more developed ones at adopting some new technologies like mobile payments, like cryptocurrencies. But that's hardly the case for AI so far. And that's because, on the contrary, you have skills and data accumulation that is really an advantage on the supply side, especially for AI and analytics. And so far, except for those rare cases of mobile payments, for instance, and some specific business models, we tend to see the accumulation game dominating the leapfrogging one. with very little catching and visible so far. In addition to that, you see the developed countries claim that they want to accelerate their digital transformation even more and to bet very big on AI, which is the case for the US, for Europe, and for China. And so the three blocks are clearly betting and investing a lot more, which is going to accelerate their development and therefore potentially even grow the divide. So I'd like to end up with one maybe good question to kick the discussion off, and that's what's the impact of that on global stability and development? Well, to start with, it's quite clear that such imbalances that you see growing in terms of profit accumulation, but also in terms of skills and data concentration, for instance, are a potential source of instability at every level. This is true, of course, between the North and the South, but this is true also within countries when you see a growing digital divide, for instance, even among given population. This being said, to some extent, the fact that resources are being reallocated towards more efficient or profitable models is not necessarily a bad thing of itself. I would claim it's even a healthy thing in a market economy. But there are two potential issues that I would like to conclude this introductory comments on. The first one is that if labor and social mobility are not sufficient, if the labor and social mobility frameworks or mechanisms are broken, then we're in trouble. And I think we are. And the second is if you see new forms of barriers to entry and to innovation that arise, for instance, because you need data to innovate or you need specific skills to innovate, and those are concentrated within the hands of a few, then you have a problem again. And I think these are the two animals that you are dealing with here: insufficient labor and social mobility within and across countries, and growing barriers to entry and innovation due to the accumulation of data and skills that are increasingly concentrated within a few hands. And with that, I would like to leave those two questions for the debate.
Right, thank you. Nicholas. That's a great summary of where we're at, and you've identified some of the challenges as well for us. So thank you. Let's hear next from Teresa, and I'm sure she can build on your remarks. The floor is yours, Teresa.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for inviting me and for this opportunity for discussing these important issues. So let me briefly introduce myself. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at European Centre of Living Technology, but before this role, I've been working in Bristol at University of Bristol in UK, where I contributed to a European project. And currently, I'm working on the AI for You project, which is an Horizon 2020 project aiming at gathering AI stakeholders into a unique platform. And in this project, I collaborate with Atia Cortez, who is also attending, one of the panelists present here, and with other colleagues. And within this project, I'm contributing both to a creation and coordination of an observatory on society and AI, but also to the maintenance of working groups on legal and ethical AI. And in this context of AI working groups, we're trying to put people from different fields and with different expertise work together in order to better understand and reflect upon the ethical and legal issues of artificial intelligence and big data technology. And we recently presented the work we have done in a workshop held last September. And yeah, if you want to learn more, please, about these activities, contact me. And with respect on this topic, in the work we have done in the context of the AI for You project, we observed that imbalances with respect to data, big data, and also technology, artificial intelligence technologies, is an issue that we need to tackle for sure. Within the community of AI, probably when we talk about imbalances, we are probably more familiar with algorithmic fairness and very specific technical notions of discriminations. But actually, when we talk about imbalances and bias in general discrimination, we are talking about a broader theme. And in fact, even when we studied in the context of the observatory. One of the study we did was an analysis of European national strategies. So our main focus, even in the project AI for EU, was Europe. So we started analyzing European national AI strategies. So strategies proposed by European member states. And we analyzed investment plans. And when we looked at these topics, we observed that actually northern countries are investing, seems at least to invest more with respect to other countries. For example, the Netherlands, but even Denmark reported investments in specific areas, also in quantitative terms with respect to educations for studying, for example, the impact of AI to work, for retraining of workers, and so on. And this somehow gives us, is a proxy. I mean, of course, the sources of informations we consider is limited, because there are many other documents where European member states reported their investment plans. But with respect to these documents, we observe that for sure there is the risk of creating imbalances even within Europe. And this is, I think, something that we should consider carefully, because actually, the whole European strategies is based on an agreement signed by all member states, including Norway, where all member states somehow committed to collaborate and to establish synergies. So these developments and this even idea and this vision of a human-centered AI should be developed together. So I think this is kind of make us think on how we could contribute on increasing, and for sure, European projects and these initiatives that can also contribute to create collaborations among different people from different European member states, and even from different small media enterprises and universities across Europe, can be an engine for, moving a step forward in these trustworthy AI plans and ideal.
Great. No, thanks, Teresa. So yeah, I mean, that's an important issue, that we've obviously got these inequalities and different approaches within Europe as well. And that's obviously going to reflect how Europe relates to the rest of the world. Let's come back to some of that when we've heard from the other speakers, but thank you for those opening remarks. Let's turn to Atir now. So Atir, you obviously working with Teresa, so I'm sure you can complement what she's just said. So go on.
So hello, good afternoon, and thank you also for the invitation. So I will also introduce myself and where I come from. So at the Barcelona Supercomputing Center, other than participating in the AI for EU project, I'm also a member of a program called Bioinfo for Women, where we try to promote the research career of young females, especially in the area of bioinformatics, AI, and high-performance computing. One of the main objectives, other than the visualization, is to investigate the gender and sex biases in AI and healthcare. And this is because there has been systematically and historically some biases in the data and the models that were carried on clinical trials. And that now with the use of AI, we have observed that are being perpetrated. So we want to raise awareness on this issue and try to promote best practices and fairness indicators to try to reduce the gender gap in this field of research. And it is especially important to have this gender perspective in Europe, but also in a worldwide perspective, because we have observed that this digital gap is even more present with a gender perspective, a gender gap, and especially in low and middle income countries, where women in general have less access to technology and devices. So if we are moving towards this digital transformation in which citizens will become also data producers, then we need to do it in an inclusive way. Then regarding the AI for EU project, as Teresa mentioned it, we are co-directing this Observatory on Society and AI, where we want to create this space for reflection and dissemination of the ethical, legal, socioeconomic, and cultural aspects of AI made in Europe. So we have performed different tasks during these 2 years. One of them is the working groups that Teresa mentioned, but I would like to highlight other two. One is the work that we did in collaboration with the high-level expert group and the European Commission, piloting the trustworthy AI guidelines and the assessment list for these trustworthy guidelines. So what we did was to run 50 in-depth interviews with organizations, Teresa and I and another group of people who were part of AI for EU and other were external. So we had these interviews to understand their views on trustworthy AI, their feedback on this assessment list, and try to see if they were already applying best practices or any kind of standards towards trustworthiness. And what we saw is that there was a general acceptance to these requirements, but there was also a different maturity in the levels of AI being implemented and embedded in the business models. And this was independent of the business sector. But what we could also observe is that there was a possible gap when we talk about the adaptation of AI governance, depending on the type of organization. So we saw big differences between, for example, large companies compared to SMEs or research centers due to different factors such as the economical or human resources that these organizations have. So I believe that here in Europe, we need to develop some strategies to boost the AI uptake, which is one of the pillars of the European strategy for AI. And we need to do it at all levels to try to widen this gap between the large and the small companies, and moreover, monitor those that are not yet adopting AI in their models, or that they are just starting to do it. And then another work that I wanted to mention is that, so last year we were monitoring the debate on the contact tracing apps that spread after the COVID-19 pandemic, with a focus on the European regulatory framework and the social impact of this technology. So indeed, the pandemic helped to accelerate the digital transformation in different areas, especially we can see the professional environment, home office environments, education, but also other more related to culture or shopping, for example. And it has also offered the opportunity to extend the legal and the ethical use of the technology, and especially the personal data, for a greater good, which would be the healthcare and the safety. There was a big debate concerning the technical aspects like architecture, interoperability, security, but there was also a critical ethical question raised after this. That is, if this technology would be inclusive with all social groups, regardless the age, the gender, or the income, or if it will foster any kind of discrimination, especially if this technology should help to take any kind of decisions for policymakers or governments. So I believe this question is very relevant in the current context of Europe, where artificial intelligence and especially automated decision-making systems are every day being more included in many public services, such as healthcare or administration. And for this, we need to design and deploy AI systems with an inclusive perspective that guarantees a good data governance and other of the ethical requirements of the high-level expert group guidelines to ensure trustworthiness and accountability, and also very important to be accepted by citizens. And of course, all these will come at a cost, an economic cost, but I think it can also be seen as an innovation opportunity towards the responsible development of AI in Europe.
Great, no, thanks, Ate. You've raised a lot of issues and angles on this topic, which hopefully we'll get to at least some of them during the discussion. But let's finally hear from Audrey before we talk as a panel. Audrey, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Audrey Plunk. I'm the head of digital economy policy at the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris. Our work focuses in a few different dimensions that are relevant to this conversation. The first is sort of cross-country comparison and measurement of a variety of factors, including investments, research, development, collaboration in artificial intelligence. And we could talk a little bit about kind of what we see, but largely speaking, in the data that we have, and we launched last year an AI observatory at oecd.ai, where you can look at all different sorts of data sets about how artificial intelligence is developing across a set of countries, OECD members, but much broader than that as well. And for example, you can see what countries are collaborating with each other in terms of research based on publications, for example, across different research universities. And I think David mentioned at the beginning, you can see that there's a strong tilt toward the United States and China being very collaborative and intra-Europe being very collaborative. And so for us, it begs the question of, from an international perspective, how we continue to advance a global view of artificial intelligence. The second area where our work is relevant is just broadly on data governance and the connections between the proliferation of data and the need for data to fuel AI. And I think there's a lot of different ways we could talk about that problem. And I'll leave it to our expert moderator to take us where he'd like us to go. But I think we certainly see that at the firm level, and then to some degree at the country level, those that have developed and implemented basic digital skills or basic digital transformation are much more likely and able to adopt these emerging technologies, including the use of data to advance innovation and productivity and ultimately sort of a place in the world. And so I think it certainly continues to raise the interesting question of how do you balance those sort of the data owners, the countries and the entities that have lots of data with those who are maybe less connected. And I think it does bring us back to a fundamental question about how our economies and our countries are connected to one another, how connectivity drives innovation and the use of data, as we know that they are at least precursors to the ability to adopt technologies like artificial intelligence. And so the question of is the divide widening or narrowing is, I think, a very interesting one that I think we have lots of different slices of the puzzle to look at. And I'm very interested in the discussion going forward. So I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Audrey. I'm going to actually stay with you actually for the first question in the panel, which, I mean, you just mentioned it there, is do you think the divide is getting wider or is it narrowing? I mean, Nicholas made this point, which I thought was a very good one, is you've got two countervailing forces. You've got this leapfrog effect, which potentially helps those who are behind at the moment, but you've also got this accumulation effect, accumulation of skills and technologies and resources, etc. So in your view, is from a geopolitical or global level, do you see the divide getting wider at the moment?
I think it's hard to say in a totally binary way. I think we see when we just look at things like patent applications and research collaboration, we see the United States and China very far ahead of a lot of other countries, including the EU, if you take it as a block. If we're releasing some new data in the next few weeks on VC investments, and there you'll see the United States is way ahead of even China and everywhere else. So I think it does. That's only one way to think about that question, though. Is it widening or is it narrowing? There's lots of different ways to think about it. So I don't have a yes or no answer, or it's widening or it's narrowing, but I think we should continue to pose a lot of questions about that in order to sort of go back to the fundamentals that Nicholas mentioned about the rationale for the internet and for the sort of democratization and equalization of what we hope technology would bring society, and look at different ways of measuring, is it taking us in the direction we want or isn't it? And if it's not, what are the levers that we have from a policy perspective and perhaps other perspectives as well to address that? And I do think data is going to be one of those key drivers. It's non-rivalrous. It's value add for the economy, and we're desperately, many economists, including those at the OECD, are trying to understand how to value it and how to understand its worth. And that's a tricky puzzle that we can talk more about. But it's certainly the case. I think it's, at least in my sphere, undebatable that it is a resource, and it is a critical resource for the future of our economies.
Yeah, so I thank you. So the logic goes, if you've got more data, potentially you've got more resources in this digital economy. But let's turn to Teresa, actually, just looking actually within Europe, because you raised this issue. And do you see a gap widening in Europe between, Nicholas again mentioned the northwest of the continent and the southeast? Is Europe itself kind of fragmenting and seeing a wider gap opening up? What are your thoughts on that, Teresa? Teresa, you're on mute, actually.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it's difficult to answer because we studied, a selected set of documents, so we should consider a wider, of course, sources of information. But if we look at what we studied, there is a kind of gap, or at least a starting, divide between, yes, northern countries and South countries, but in particular with respect to education. And this is a key, I think, also for understanding, or at least to predict or to make sense of possible increases in these gaps and this digital divide. Because if we act on education, we could for sure, let's say, provide the resources and the conceptual tools also to understand and to be the protagonist of the digital transformations. And this holds for the world societies. So increasing, for example, there are interesting initiatives in the North Europe for improving and distributing knowledge about AI to the world societies, or even citizens, anyone who is interested. And these are free courses, mock courses. The name is Elements of AI, I think. This is one, yeah. But there are also different initiatives, even that similar to this one. But also, I think it's crucial to increase and trying to tackle this gap within the experts of people from who are dealing with trustworthy AI, because this also vision of a human-centric AI, a more inclusive AI, sustainable AI, deals with a large set of disciplines. And we should ensure that people trying to, let's say, understand each other, people who are somehow the actors who can have some power on the steps we want to make in the future. And so there are, for example, countries who are trying to introduce courses on AI and data science and big data into all programs at universities at several levels, to make sure that people somehow, even those who are, for example, studying the humanities, are somehow aware and become familiar with this language, but also the other way around, which is still very important. So introduce ethics and concerns regarding the social impact into engineering, computer science disciplines, STEM in general. And there are also interesting experiments. For example, in our workshop last 2 weeks ago, we hosted a panel on AI ethics education. And one of the experience shared was from the University of Harvard, where they embedded ethics and legal aspects into the computer science courses. And I think this somehow we would need more of this experience in order to tackle, and at least to trying to tackle this divide, because there is the potential that it gets bigger and bigger.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I'm going to come back to some of the social aspects in a minute, actually, and the education is obviously a big part of that. But first of all, just Nicholas, I just wanted to put it to you, how policymakers should think about AI. I mean, I mentioned that it could become as indispensable as electricity, this kind of fundamental sort of thing that people need access to. Is that a good way to think about it? I mean, another analogy is that it's somehow oil, and that countries, data is oil, and the countries can kind of tap this resource. What's a good way for policymakers to think about this as as a strategic asset, let's say?
Well, I think first of all, you need to distinguish the algorithm from the data. You have the technology to process the data, that's AI, and then you have the data itself, which is supposed to be oil. So the best comparison you could come up with, I guess, is the internal combustion engine and oil, indeed, AI being the engine then. Well, the comparison holds to some extent in the sense that likewise oil data is costly to extract. That is for sure, and it's needed to run the engine, that's for sure as well, and it needs to be refined. So raw or crude data is of no use. But that's where the analogy ends, because there's something very specific about data that does not apply to the physical economy. The first one is that data is not like oil, it's not a pure commodity. In the sense that, first of all, it's more like fish, it's better when it's fresh. That's one thing, and the second is that it's not universally relevant and exploitable. Data on African country X, for instance, would be of no use in a European market. So you can just trade data from one country and then exploit it elsewhere for your own market. You need contextual data. So that's something that's a bit different, and that I think is overlooked. Because data as such is of no value. It's only of value if you know what to do with it to serve a given purpose. So what really matters is the full data ecosystem. And that's what we should rather be looking at rather than data itself. And that's where it becomes a bit worrying indeed, because what you see is that you need a whole ecosystem in place in order to produce or to extract, to refine, and then to exploit the data. And unfortunately, this whole sort of machinery that you need in order to extract, refine, and exploit the data really benefits from economies of scale on the supply side and on the demand side. That's what we call the network effect, and that's what creates this accumulation effect that make us end up in a very strange situation in which you have actually the engine that is entirely in one continent and actually extracting data from another continent and yet serving this original continent from which the data serves. So if you wanted to stick to the oil analogy, you would imagine that actually it's like if the US were actually extracting oil from Africa and then sending the refined oil or even the power that is produced by the engine itself back into Africa. That means that all of the value is actually created elsewhere and captured elsewhere. And so that's the thing that's really critical to understand, is that you need the full ecosystem in place. And that's what Europe, also developing countries need to invest in, is make sure that they have an ecosystem in place to extract, exploit the data locally. Otherwise, it will always end up in the hands of the happy few.
Yeah, the raw material itself is not enough in this context, clearly. No, thank you, Nicholas. Tia, I wanted to come to you on a different aspect of the AI and data dynamic, which is this winner-takes-all concept and some of the social and economic implications of that, both within societies and between countries as well. So this winner-takes-all, first of all, how important is it? And two, what are the ramifications of that?
Yeah, so thank you. I like what just Nicolas mentioned it, and I think it relates to this question, because in the end, if we are talking about this analogy of data with oil and all the ecosystem that goes beyond, then we are talking in the end about data being some kind of power. And so we need to take care that this power doesn't rely to only few big companies that become even more powerful, and then that will wide inequalities with other organizations. But also, if we talk about the geolocalization of these organizations, then there will have also a geographic very important inequality. Then it will be continued if we maintain this. So in the end, I believe that there should be some mechanisms to let's say protect the data and the source of the data. For example, here in Europe, we had the problem, as you mentioned it before, that so the big companies are mainly in China and in the US. And most of the data that we are generating as citizens then doesn't doesn't stay here in Europe, and the same happens with other areas of the world. So I believe that we should put some kind of mechanisms to try to let's say, protect this data and engage that the digital transformation process also stays in a more local dimension, let's say.
Yeah, okay, we're going to come on, I think we'll come on to a little bit more of that in the second segment when we talk about
Okay.
but, I want just to actually build on that topic a little bit further actually with Audrey, because you may have some data around this actually, or you may have looked at this, but really to what extent or how important is government investment in AI and data analytics? In other words, to what extent can governments actually sort of kickstart this dynamic? Because obviously Silicon Valley's an interesting example. It's private sector driven, but there are suggestions that a lot of it was originally came out of US defense spending, for example. So what's the importance or significance of government investment?
Thanks, David. It's a good question. And yeah, I mean, historically, certainly with regard to the internet, the historical funding, you know, that sort of got us down this track did come from the US defense community. I think both government investment, but also government strategy is important. And so we look at research of the R&D funding at the national level, and I think we have some data on that. It's imperfect, like most data are, and I think what we've seen is that's important, but also national strategies are important. And so I think when you combine those two, we haven't done that quantitatively in order to show a direct correlation, but I think, or at least a causal relationship, but I think we do see a strong correlation between when countries are really organized and they have a strong national strategy. And part of that national strategy is R&D investment, which is, for example, part of the OECD AI principles is the recommendation for governments to invest in research and development, that countries are making progress on AI. I do want to say that I think we've seen a proliferation of national AI strategies in the last 2 years, honestly, and we have that data available on the observatory. You can look at what countries are doing there. And just at least anecdotally, we've seen a lot of growth around those strategies. The minute that the government puts sort of some high level targets in place, you know, it sort of inspires a whole bunch of activity, both in the private sector and in the public sector. So we continue to watch these trends. It's all still quite new. I mean, the OECD AI principles were adopted in May of 2019. There's a strong focus on R&D. But even in the last 2 years, we've seen significant change in how countries organize themselves around that, and those who are organized and making investments, whether private or public or both, ideally, seem to be having a better outcome.
You're muted. Oh.
Sorry, yeah, that's a classic. Yeah, no, we're approaching the second segment, but thank you, Audrey. So I just want to get quick comments from the rest of the panel on that particular topic, which will pave the way nicely for the next discussion, is to what extent can governments actually change this and influence this, and to what extent can governments have an impact on the development of AI and data analytics. So just very quickly, I'll go around each of the panel, maybe start with Nicholas. Just a quick comment on, you know, can governments make a real difference?
I think yes, and at least in three ways. The first one is clearly in creating the market. That's the defense effect that Audrey and you, David, were referring to with the rise of the internet. And you see that with facial recognition in China, for instance, where clearly the government decided to create the market entirely. You can do that, and it creates, of course, a very strong force on the demand side. The second thing is regulation, which you can see in a positive way, like a level playing field guarantee, which is very hard to achieve. But in fact, I more often see regulation as a risk because it often creates costs that are unbearable for small firms to comply with. And that's a big challenge with regulation. You want to regulate, but in the end, you end up making life more difficult for SMEs and for young innovators. And I think that's something we need to be very careful about. So it's in a sense, do not do harm in the first place. That's number two. This being said, regulation is very much needed in this space. And number three is clearly skills. And that's what Teresa was emphasizing very, very rightfully. The one single thing that governments should definitely do is to invest in skills, because that's the biggest market failure of all with digitization. And that's the one thing where the public is really needed.
Great, thanks, Nicholas. Good summary. Teresa, Atir, just quick comments from you on that.
Yeah, I agree. There are positive and potential negative, aspects. On the positive side, I think that, governments funding can support, for example, the introductions of ethics guidelines and regulations on AI. So can at least support this European vision and trying to, ensure that the development of AI is aligned with the ethics guidelines and existing laws. On the other hand, there is, the risk as we increases, the role of governments. We should also have some other independent organizations looking at the work that governments are doing, because, as we increase the adoption, but even the funding by the governments, there is also the spectrum of, the increase in surveillance and also in opacity of bureaucracy and public services. So I think we should balance both more independence and also government national level investments.
Yeah, governments don't have a monopoly on wisdom in this space. So no, thank you, Teresa. And Atir, final comments from you?
Yeah, we'll do it very quickly, but I believe that the main challenge that now governments have, and especially here in Europe, it's how to retain the talent that it's created here. So both in the academia and in the private sector, especially in SMEs, which is one of the bases of our economy. So how we can retain this and how can we boost the excellence in both research and development.
Great, no, thank you, Tir. So I'd like to thank you all speakers for their contribution to that first segment, but I'd like you all to stay with us if you can and potentially put some questions to our second set of speakers, because we're going to turn to this topic of precisely what Europe should do at an EU level and also at a member state level, and whether the region is actually following the right strategy and what practical steps it should take to address the global data divide. Just before we get to the lead speakers, I'm just going to quickly highlight some relevant aspects of Europe's new global approach to research and innovation, which it announced in May 2021. And this was updated an initiative from 2012, I should say. It calls for Europe to scale up its research and innovation partnerships at a multilateral level to tackle global challenges such as climate change and the health crisis. So it implies that Europe wants to engage more internationally across research and innovation, and including digital technologies. It calls for the EU to rebalance its cooperation with other countries with more reciprocity and ensure a level playing field at an international level. So there's some concrete actions which have been identified in that. And one is to agree an EU-China joint roadmap on science, technology and innovation. It's also to develop a strategic research and innovation plan for Africa and launch a comprehensive Africa initiative under Horizon Europe. So again, more engagement is implied by that. And also there's a section on promoting the digital transition, which actually looks to create a joint task force on artificial intelligence with India, which is to establish common ground for collaboration on specific use cases and things like ethical AI and standardization. So Europe's trying to engage with like-minded countries elsewhere in the world to kind of further this broader agenda. So there is a recognition, I think, at an EU level that there needs to be more engagement on these topics, but the question is this enough? And should this global approach be supplemented by other types of initiative or other types of engagements? So on that topic, I'm going to turn to Jeremy Rollinson. He's the Senior Director, EU Government Affairs at Microsoft. And then after him, we'll hear from Catherine Stover. She's Chief Communications Officer at Géant. And after her, from Hilary Hanaho, who's Secretary General of the Research Data Alliance. So Jeremy, first of all, I'll turn the floor to you, and then we'll get into a panel discussion later.
Well, thank you, David, and thanks for the chance to speak to everyone. I've had, for my role here in Brussels, I manage our data policy engagement and work with colleagues in Redmond and mostly in Europe on a lot of our data messaging and experiences from customers and the like. And I actually think that this event, and a lot of what Nicola was saying as well, you know, listen, I think we're in large agreement about this, especially some of the risks that are linked to this idea of a data divide. We have witnessed that as well, both from, you know, a regional perspective and a company perspective. You know, I don't think we would dispute a lot of the findings that others have highlighted here. There is this risk of data increasingly finding its way into the hands of fewer jurisdictions, fewer regions, and fewer companies in that context. And the risk of that is that whether it's biases that are built in, the real risk is that the benefits that could come from AI and the benefits that come from data would also then be limited only to select groups. And so I think this concept of a data divide is something that not only we've witnessed, it's something that we've identified and are working to address. You know, I would bring everyone's attention to just the fact that, you know, it was 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago, a year and a half now, in April 2020, we launched a global open data campaign, very much recognizing this data divide and what Microsoft, at least, and some of our partners could do to help address it. And it starts from the same premise. You know, we have witnessed, and via different studies and estimates, just how much data is being created and where that data is ultimately going. Again, this concentration into certain countries and certain companies. You know, I don't think anybody thinks that's a good thing. We've heard about some of the risks in the previous panel. What we're doing, and we think a way, I think I might be a little bit more optimistic than some previous speakers about what we can do about it. And then I can talk a little bit about where I think Europe is taking the right steps. You know, we think one way to address this is kind of what we call the campaign. It's an open data approach. Now, that doesn't mean opening up all forms of data for all types of use to any players, but the more open we can be with data, the better. And it comes back to a point that was, I think, made earlier, that it's not just the value of data here. It really is the insights that you get from that data where the value is really obtained. So it is about making sure that you have talent around that, making sure you have access to technology that can be used to analyze these data sets. And what Microsoft has done with our campaign that was launched in April of 2020, we've had a 1-year anniversary from that now and shared some of those learnings. But we've committed to standing up 20 data collaborations by 2022, all of which would have data outcomes that are open by default, working with partners in many cross-border scenarios to address societal needs and outcomes. So partnerships that are focused on, you know, health outcomes, environmental outcomes. We've done a lot in a COVID context, working with particular cities. And the idea there is to show, you know, what can be achieved when different sets of players come together, either providing data, providing technology, providing expertise, you know, to solve common problems. And again, we've taken a few examples of that from an environmental space, health context, and COVID actually accelerated some of the projects in that space. And we're going to continue to announce them. And we've learned a lot of things along the way. One is something that was said earlier, that, you know, a lot of times this doesn't require the creation of new data. We can learn a lot from the data we have, applying different research, different tools to that data. And again, the concept here is making sure you have access to the talent, making sure you have access to those technologies. Everyone has a bit of a piece here. And if you come together around that, it doesn't mean opening up everything for everyone to use however they want, but with the right protocols in place, with the right type of project questions and outcomes, you know, you do get to see what can be done with enhanced collaboration, so that we're avoiding this concentration of data and its insights into the hands of only a few. I think Europe has recognized this in their data strategy, which has a number of legislative outputs that, you know, we'll be working on, and I'll certainly be working on over the next couple of years. I think at a very high level, you know, we talk about, I was just mentioning open data, and I think more often than not, that has a reference to kind of public sector data in Europe, and that makes a lot of sense. I think what we're really talking about is data sharing and data collaboration. How do we make sure that, you know, data that may be in the hands of certain countries and certain companies, you know, the benefits aren't just staying there. There's a lot of data at our disposal, whether it's public sector data, company data, and there's even, you know, of course, private data. All of these have different sensitivities and challenges to them. And when we think about our customers who may be reluctant to share more data, you start to look at the reasons why. Is it fears around privacy when we're talking about personal data? Certainly valid concerns there. Are there fears around IP loss? Are there fears around competition? Sometimes it's simply a bit of misunderstanding about what tools are available and how would I even share data in the first place. So part of our campaign has included commitments to identifying key principles here of what data collaboration and data sharing should feature. So it's the usability of that data, it's the accessibility of that data, but then also highlighting some of the tools and technologies that mitigate a bit or hopefully address some of those reservations that we talked about. So there are exciting developments like differential privacy, where we can inject certain amounts of noise to certain data sets, where you may sacrifice a bit of accuracy, but you get a lot more privacy because of that. And in certain scenarios, that can be appropriate. We talk about confidential computing. We talk about homomorphic encryption, ways that researchers can get access to data sets without perhaps needing access to the raw data itself, but we can create ciphers for raw data that allow analytics and allows processing to glean some of those insights without having a player, an entity feeling as though they're losing control of that data or turning it over for someone to see. I think in the European strategy for data, this opportunity is recognized very well. I think they call out this data divide as well, and the risks that would come from data falling into the hands of only a few, and where the rules might be dictated there. Data sharing, understandably, in the strategy that the Commission has put out, it figures pretty prominently. And I think we agree with that 100%. The more that we can encourage this mindset shift about being more open with data, I think the better off we'll all be. Another way to put it, and if you look at Microsoft's own journey there with open source and the like, the companies of the future that are going to be most successful are going to be those we believe that are most open. It's very unlikely that any one company on their own has enough data to be successful at AI. You're going to need to get access to other data sets, cooperate with different sets of partners, use different types of technologies. And I think that's going to be the case across the board. So making sure that people are aware of what's available and have access to those technologies. And it's worth repeating, because I've heard said earlier, it's making sure you have the talent and the skills around that too. So I mentioned the European strategy for data and some of the ideas that they have to make data sharing more trusted, to make sure that we're seeing more of that across industries in Europe, particularly leveraging some of Europe's industrial data and clarifying, how that can be shared, under what conditions, and really hopefully encouraging it. But it's also worth mentioning the European Commission's commitment to skills uptake. If you look at the 2030 goals, if you look at the Pact for Skills that's been announced, if you look at many of the recovery funds, prioritization of skilling and digitization, I think that's a great start. We think that's a great start. I think what we want to measure it by ultimately, if you take those goals that I just mentioned, is let's make sure that the rules we're creating and the provisions that we're launching do allow for that access to that talent, to those sets of tools, to those technologies, to those platforms. Open is a key word here, both in the context of data and in the context of access to the talent, to the technologies, to the types of software. A lot of this has been made possible, and I think there's a bigger opportunity here because of the technology that's emerged to analyze vast data sets so quickly and drive those insights. We want to make sure that that's accessible to European companies and European researchers, and that they're also developing that locally as well. So it's skilling, it's clarity on the rules. I think a lot of that has been recognized at a high level, and we're just starting to see some of those outputs now. But I think we should measure them by exactly how much data sharing do we create. There's a lot of different scenarios here, and I think it gets confusing when people talk about open data and data sharing. It just means that David or Jeremy would open up all their data for anybody to do anything they want with. And that's not, there are scenarios where that may make sense, but there are so many different scenarios along the way that we can take more open approaches to drive beneficial outcomes, to hopefully limit the extent to which data would be concentrated in the hands of a select few, with the benefits bleeding out that way. So I'll stop there and can provide more specifics if there's any questions, but hopefully that sets the scene a bit.
Right, no, thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, I think you've painted a picture of Europe's strategy very clearly there. question is, I guess, how that relates to the rest of the world and some of the influence that Europe can exert elsewhere as well. But we'll get into that topic a little bit later. But let's turn to Catherine now, because Catherine and Jehan have got a great insight into how European research relates to that going on in other regions and some of the data flows between those regions. So Catherine, let's give the floor to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, and good afternoon to you all. My name is Katrin Stöver, and I am CCO at GEANT, the Pan-European Research and Education Network. Across Europe, GEANT interconnects approximately 50 million users in research and education institutions. And in this effort, of course, we are partnering with Europe's national research and education networks. You may know our well-known access service is EduRoam, available across thousands of hotspots across Europe and internationally to students and academia. And I'd like to thank Science Business for the invitation to this session, which allows me to share the GEANT experience over the last 20 years in establishing GEANT-like infrastructures in other parts of this world, and including, of course, the Global South. So I think I'm going to speak particularly on the issues we have in the Global South. Over the last 20 years, and thanks to generous European Commission funding, our activities have led to the creation of major dedicated data communications networks for research and education in Latin America, in Asia, and of course in Africa. And today, researchers in Europe have access to direct research and education networks in over 110 countries. Basically, we exist from Hawaii to New Zealand, the other way around, and equally EduRoam is available from Iceland to Zambia. So data needs to travel, and data needs connectivity. And at GEANT, we have a very good overview of the cost of the underlying connectivity. And for me, when I look at the digital divide, that is still the point. We have a good overview of the cost of the underlying connectivity in Europe and also from Europe to other continents. We also know what connectivity costs in other world regions as we support the procurement activities of our peers around the world. And what we see across the world is a digital divide and a data divide based simply on the lack of affordable connectivity. And I have to stress that this is not a lack of cables anymore. It used to be, but it is no longer. Let's talk a little bit about the Global South and allow me to focus on Africa. From a cable perspective, Africa is one of the best connected continents in the world by now. Internet penetration, however, is still the lowest worldwide. And let me give you some very clear examples of what we see in our procurements. Today in Europe, buying capacity between two major cities can cost you as little as 2 euro cents per megabit per second per month. Going from Europe to New York is about 6.5 times more expensive on average. You pay around 13 euro cents per megabit per second. And pricing is still coming down on this major route. Let's go to the Global South and compare. London-Lagos is roughly the same distance as London-New York, but about 10 to 20 times more expensive. But this is by far not the worst at all. If you want to go from, say, Abidjan or Accra in West Africa to a landlocked neighboring country up north, say Mali, Niger, or Burkina Faso, you look at pricing of 60 euros per megabit per month. Compare that to the 2 euro cents per megabit per month between two European locations. So in parts of Africa, connectivity is not just a little bit more expensive. It is 3,000 times more expensive. And that, from our perspective, is one of the major drivers of the continuing digital divide. And Western Central Africa is not alone in this, not at all. We see similar unaffordable connectivity pricing in the Southern Mediterranean, or for example, also in Central Asia, where countries are suffering from similar very high connectivity pricing. And simply, as Nicolas said, you need to build the whole ecosystem. I completely agree. A whole ecosystem is needed, but you cannot build digital economies when the underlying infrastructure is unaffordable. So I have some thoughts of what could be done, and I think there's also quite a lot that is already being done, but I just want to leave you now with this initial statement. Thanks, David.
Yeah, no, thanks, Catherine. You've laid out one of the big issues very clearly there, so thank you for that. And we will obviously return to that question about how we address that, so thank you. Let's turn to Hilary now and hear a little bit about the RDA's perspective on this issue, and then we'll get to a panel discussion. And I meant to say, by the way, we are going to take some questions from the audience. I did promise that, so do bear with us on that respect. Hilary, over to you.
Thank you, David, and thank you to Science Business for inviting me to present or to speak a little bit from the Research Data Alliance perspective. I'm the Secretary General. The Research Data Alliance is quite related actually to this topic, because our vision is that researchers and innovators can openly share and reuse data across disciplines, across countries, and across technologies. So that means anytime, any place, any scientific discipline. And we do that, if you like, our mission is to build the social and technical bridges to enable all of that and to enable the vision. And it's quite pertinent to the topic because the Research Data Alliance was conceived, if you like, by funders across the globe before around 2009, 2010, launched in 2013, by the way, but through a co-creation of programs, funding programs in the respective regions around the world with this vision and mission in mind, because to accelerate science, to keep up with the pace of innovation, we need solutions around the data interoperability, data sharing, data reuse challenges that are being faced, irrespective of where you are in the globe or what sort of science you're working around or what the if you like, the difficulties are. We do, as Jeremy sort of mentioned before, focus very much on research data or public sector data, yes, though the solutions that the Research Data Alliance bring are actually of quite good value also to commercial organizations. And the point being here that RDA is built upon foundations of openness and consensus building, community-driven activities. They're not for profit and technology neutral solutions. But the important thing is that so that from the outset, everybody can get involved in the definition of the solutions and the, if you like, data products that come out, but they are CC BY open to all. And this, in terms of digital divide or data, and direct data, is quite significant, because it means that people from across the globe come together to work on solutions. They then, of course, go off and implement them in their organizations in whatever scenarios, but all the community, irrespective of where you are, can take up, if you like, these solutions. And we have over about 50 or 60 of those solutions available. Everything done in the Research Data Alliance is volunteer, so it's by the community, for the community, by global data professionals. And we have 12,000 of these global professionals from across the globe working together in different ways. I think the key challenges in the context of this discussion today for us are I would say three, if I have to pick. There are many, but unfortunately, Catherine, Jean, with whom we work with a good deal, alluded to the cost one and the whole ecosystem. From the data perspective, it's I think trust, skills, and standards. They're the three I will highlight. Skills has been brought up by everybody, and I think that building trust and in terms of in the whole ecosystem between the people and the technologies as well, and that goes to the discussion that the comments that Jeremy made about open, and the fear that people have around the word open. But we also always say that open data is not necessarily free data, and it doesn't mean that you give it away. In fact, the concepts of fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, which are fundamental and a very key cornerstone to the European Commission's funding in Horizon Europe and Global, are, also preserve the data and go to support that. And in fact, in global context, we have a partner with the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. And they have the CARE principles, which go even a step further if you like, they talk around collective benefit, the authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And they're complementary to FAIR, and they are fundamental in not just, they were defined through or with RDA, but for the indigenous peoples who have a significant difficulties around their particular data, but actually very, very pertinent to many of the global challenges: climate, population health, urban health, and things. And we are seeing in the RDA the application of these FAIR principles with the CARE principles across, across solutions like that. I think skills is a fundamental one to help reduce the divide, and everybody has said that, to reduce the learning curve. We have an example, a good fundamental example, which through COVID, one of the positive aspects of COVID was that the data schools that RDA and CoData run for data scientists and data stewards. And actually the idea there is not they're not university degrees or master's degrees in these things, but they are fundamental courses and skills for researchers, because we understand, particularly in the global south and less developed, shall we say, countries and organizations, that they cannot afford to hire or have a data scientist or a data steward. So it's important to offer researchers who are challenged with those tasks with these skills, so that we can then assist them and upskill and reduce them. And then I think the standards piece, I mean, science is global, yeah. So as we know, and the borders are not there for, if you like, for the scientists. So standards, when required, are fundamental. They will support the interoperability, and they will support to reduce, if you like, the digital or the data divide. I like the idea, though, of, and I think I'll finish on this one, of it, a digital revolution, if you like, is the upside of this. There's a lot of opportunities because we are in a digital era. But I fully agree with what was said in the previous panel, now with my fellow panelists, and with, the overall discussions that unfortunately there will be a bigger digital divide if we don't act on it and we don't support and provide ways in which we can reduce it, and through initiatives like the Research Data Alliance, JEON, and many other, and the Open Data Initiative that Microsoft themselves are doing. So I'll stop there.
Right, no, thanks, Hilary, and thanks to each of you for setting the scene so ably. Jeremy, I'm going to start by just building on something that you said, which is around you saying that you welcomed Europe's open data strategy and its approach to actually, let's say, exploiting data more than has been possible in the past. But to what extent can Europe actually influence, encourage other regions to do the same, and to create this kind of more inclusive data environment globally? So in other words, how influential can Europe's strategy be with third countries, in your view?
Well, I think it can be very influential. I mean, we're looking at it from a regulatory perspective, perhaps in the context of the data strategy. There's a lot of investments and initiatives that the Commission has launched there too. If we think about common data spaces and some of the industrial applications, this concept that data and enhanced data access and data sharing, can help bridge this data divide. I think that goes across sectors. That's really the overarching principle. But when you start to look at where it would have relevance, perhaps in a health context, or a manufacturing context, or an environmental context, or a financial context, there are different challenges and obstacles or opportunities there, different regulations that apply to those sectors. There's different standards, there's different needs, there's different, sometimes competitive juices. Some of these are more public-private partnerships than just private-private. So you have to start from this overarching principle, and then you get down into some of the specifics that can help those sectors and those partnerships, if you will, get the most success. But if we think about the regulatory example that can be set, this implicates, in some instances, privacy protections. And I think if you look at Europe's GDPR experience and the influence an approach like that can have globally, you maybe start from that example. And then we look at, well, what kind of direction are we going to take when it comes to intellectual property in this space? How do we create a framework that still incentivizes data collection and data curation and fostering access to that data? As it was said before, open data doesn't just mean free data. There's a number of ways you can get access to that. But are we creating more conducive frameworks or more barriers to those frameworks? If we think about this in the context of rules for players operating in this space, technologies, are we doing it in a way that creates more choice on the market and creates, greater amount of access to different types of technologies that can be suited to different scenarios? Or do we run the risk of maybe pigeonholing all of this into one type of scenario and one type of use? So I think on the regulatory front, if you look at the Data Act that'll be coming out later this year, we look at the Data Governance Act that is, looking more specifically at data marketplaces and neutral models there that could be used to enhance trust in certain scenarios. You have a lot of examples that could be set that other regions could follow. If it works there, if the data sharing takes off and competitors in Europe are more comfortable being part of joint public-private initiatives or sharing data with each other that drives their global competitiveness, then I think you can see the rest of the world emulate that in as much as possible. This is a competitive space at the end of the day, but the research outputs that can be had with access to these technologies, the more that Europe can lead the way with good use cases on that are kind of highlighting the benefits of data collaboration, I think they got a great opportunity to influence regulation and approaches elsewhere.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. Is demonstrating the value of this strategy and demonstrating that it works. But I think there's some urgency around that because as the train is leaving the station, let's say. But let's turn to Catherine actually, because Catherine, you obviously raised a critical issue here in the context of the global south. What do you think Europe should do about the cost of connectivity in these other regions? And how can Europe change that dynamic you were talking about?
Well, I think the COVID pandemic has really also highlighted to national governments in the global south how much they lag behind in the development. If you look at the education sector in large parts of Northern Western Europe, the US, the Western world, education sort of shifted into the online world, but continued in large parts of the global south. Education for many just simply came to a standstill. And, this is absolutely terrible for the development of these economies. And I think that has shaken a lot of stakeholders. But when it comes to Europe, I think what we really need, what we see very often is that we speak truth to power. We speak to those telecom providers in the markets, and we are capable over 2-3 years of intense negotiation to bring pricing down by 94%. This has happened in the past, reduction of pricing by 94%. And just imagine the remaining 6% still have a large margin in there. So you can see it is doable, but it would be so much easier if the European Commission build more onto the ecosystem as such and didn't invest the funding in individual projects, but more in interconnected programs that really support each other. And they need to have regulatory dialogue. They need to have standards dialogue, as Hilary was mentioning before. And they need to have really implementation of activities that are driven by the global south and the problems they have in the global south, and not copy and paste activities from Europe or the US because they work in our economies. And I think that would make a huge difference. What we see is a change in approach from the European Commission, and also a willingness into investments into connectivity directly from Europe into other world regions. For example, in July, we launched the Bella cable system, which is independent cable system, submarine cable system between the Latin American continent and the European continent. And GERND, as Research and Education Network, we actually were an anchor tenant in this activity. And I would like to see in the new global gateway strategy that the Commission is launching, I'd like to see more of these activities in which the research and education sector could also actively contribute, and then long-term benefit from reduced connectivity and from reduced dependence on maybe other regions of the world. So
great. No, Thanks, Catherine. That's a good checklist for us to take forward, actually. So, Hilary, I'm just going to come back to you, actually, because I'll actually focus on the skills issue. As you mentioned, it's come up quite a few times. So let's focus on what we can do about it, and in particular, what Europe might do about it. I mean, I think one of the questions in this space is people worrying about the brain drain, where talent kind of flows towards particular clusters or particular geographies where the tools, the skills, the regulation is right, etc. So how can Europe actually ensure that skills are more evenly distributed, let's say?
Yeah, I think that I think given the size and the the difference of the, how would you say, the advancements of the economies, the approaches need to be different. I would say that in terms of collaboration, and I think it goes back to this reciprocity point that you talked about before. So I mean, I'm a big believer in collaboration. That is what I do. Yeah, so I'm a real optimist that it works as well. And I've seen the fruits and the impact of it and the data sharing, despite the challenges that we have. In terms of the skills, there are many good and excellent examples from Europe, but there is still a big challenge in Europe alone for skilling in terms of, as I said before, the data science, the data stewardship, and some of the challenges there. Because we know there's this wonderful fact or statistic that everybody says is that nowadays researchers are required to spend 80% of their time data wrangling, as they call it. So cleaning the data and preparing it so that then it can be made fair or accessible, or can be deposited in the ways in which their institutions require or request it. And that time needs to be reduced alone in Europe alone, but everywhere. So it should be an inherent part of the curriculum now, a certain module and thing around data science and data skills. Even better it would be if you had data scientists inside the institutions. There are many Dutch universities and institutions that have that privilege and that capacity, but many others don't. So, but this upskilling would definitely be important to this interoperability and the fact that science is global, yes, and to help share the data and to reduce the digital divide. So they are investing a lot. I mean, the Commission, I think what they're planning for the next few years around skills is very positive, but it should, I believe, be coupled with other parts, as Catherine referred to, like building the ecosystem. So skills alone won't help. Infrastructure alone, infrastructure is a big investment, as we know, and a costly one, but you need to sort of balance the two. And the Commission, I would say, if I could say this, the European Commission is our funder, one of our funders, and they've invested a significant amount of money with the US government and the Australian government since the beginning. They were the believers, they were the drivers, they are the ones. And often I get the question, so why, why would they continue to invest, Europe? They, apart from the diplomatic answer to that Europe is a very, one of the regions or continents in the world that supports, this openness and this interglobal collaboration. But actually the return on investment, just in the RDA context alone, is that over half of our individual members, 6,000 of them, are from Europe. There are hundreds of examples of how the outputs that are open and are helping to build the infrastructures and the research infrastructures that are required now by member states, but also Europe to, with this open science, open data mandate that they have. And many of the solutions will actually be little pieces, if you like, the little nuts and bolts of this European Open Science Cloud that the Commission is investing significant amount of money in. So, and the global perspective from RDA has, facilitated that. These aren't European solutions; these are global solutions that then are being used also in open science commons and research commons. And domain-specific commons across the globe too. And the solutions with skills, with infrastructure, as we say, part of the whole ecosystem. So.
Great, no, thanks, Hilary. So it is in Europe's interest. Now, I want to leave a bit of time for audience Q&A, and we're approaching the top of the hour. So let's quickly trot through some of the questions that we're getting in. There's one here for Jeremy, which is, what about international data sharing in the future EU data spaces? You mentioned these data spaces earlier, Jeremy. What do you think? How international will they be, do you think?
I think it's a fantastic question but you have to look at it from both ways. I mean, if you look, you can completely understand the Commission's aim here to leverage European data for European companies and European researchers and European players to make these companies more competitive. Nobody, I think, should disagree with that outcome. But in order for that data that's expected to be pooled and leveraged and insights pulled from that, you want to make sure that it's accessible to, again, the best talent, the best technologies, in terms of the ambition for those data spaces and this data sharing opportunity that we've talked about. I think everyone's on board with that. I think it's a great way to look at it. Again, looking at those sector specific needs. Depending on what scenarios you're after, you wouldn't want to limit the ambition of any of those data spaces by restricting the technologies that could be used, restricting the type of minds or talent that could be brought together on that. But you can also appreciate, the political aims. They're not set up for, other regions to just go and profit from them. Of course, we want to make sure that we're doing this in the interest of, European companies, European researchers. But you want those companies and researchers to have access to the best tools, and you want them to be in control of the project. So I think there's a good opportunity there to kind of reflect where this data sharing opportunity is. The concept here is that the more you're collaborating on this and you have access to data, the better the outcomes can be, whether it's because you're using the right tools, you're bringing forward the right questions from the right researchers. If we're talking about some common problems, think about all the learnings from the COVID-19 crisis. I think you'd be much more restricted in your potential outcomes if you were only looking at data sets from a very narrow set of regions. The more regions and experiences you can bring together, the better your strategy could be launched locally, because you're bringing in all of that different data. Some of that could be applied to the concept of the data spaces, but again, the opportunity here is one around collaboration, and you wouldn't want to limit that. So I would look at it from that perspective.
Great, no, thanks, Jeremy. If I could just bring back Audrey, there's a question here about the OECD directly, actually. So it's how is the OECD addressing the global north-south divide, especially in AI? So I think that's a question about whether this is actually an action for the OECD itself. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I'm pleased to say that the OECD membership increasingly includes countries from the Southern Hemisphere. Most recently, Costa Rica joined the OECD. But that said, regardless of member countries or not, we have a lot of collaboration around the world globally, including with the Global South on artificial intelligence. So if you go to the observatory, OECD.ai, but also we have a network of experts on artificial intelligence that includes experts from many countries across the Global South. So we are trying to work with those countries, whether they're OECD members or not, and we've seen a lot of adoption, an increased adoption of the OECD AI principles as a sort of starting point for some of the countries that are more in the development phase to take to get into the AI space and to develop policies and strategies at the government level to advance AI. So I would say it is within our scope and our desire and mandate to work with those countries, and we look forward to it. And they've been many engaged. And again, in the interest of time, I'll just send you to the observatory. You can have a look at who's participating there. Thanks a lot for the question.
No, thanks, Audrey. Now, just we're right on the top of the hour here, but just if there's any other questions, quick questions for anybody, either from the segments, the first segment, any of the speakers or anybody else wants to ask a quick question, now is the time. Edith, do you want to have you a quick question?
Yes, I'd like to come in because I was really surprised. My name is Edith Herzog, and I'm the member of the Global Council of RDA, but also senior advisor at GEAN. So I actually meet both the hard and the soft part of the data. And I am just surprised that the question of the SDGs and the question of the climate didn't came up, neither the question of COVID, which was just recently shown, that how the global data is a critical importance for the developed world. Yeah, imagine the COVID if we wouldn't have the information in the right time or across the globe. Imagine the climate without having a data collected by the in New Zealand or in the middle of the Sahara. I think that we have to be aware that we are independent on each other by the data, and just because they do not have necessarily the hard infrastructure, or they have but they are overpricing it, we can do it without. And I think that we have to think and change our mindset to think not from our perspective, but from the common perspective to tackle the SDGs, which is commonly agreed by all the countries signed to it, etc. And I'd like to give you one example that when I joined to the RDA, that was the major driver. I'm originally from the agriculture sector. And when we developed first time the wheat interoperability, and we met the problem of the semantics, that the different nations use the different metrics and the different words to describe the same thing, that how difficult was it to find the common language, and how big impact finally when we could get the common standard had on the agriculture, and through the agriculture on the hunger itself, and how easily we can now move from the wheat to the rice, etc., etc. So I think that we have to think big here and then see our own issues as a part of this big thing and not on the other way around. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Edith. More of a comment than a question, but yeah, it's true that the SDGs could be a rallying call for policymakers in this space. Policymakers may, look at the global interests ahead of national interests. Just before we wrap, I just want to give the speakers, if there's any recommendations for Europe that they haven't mentioned that they'd like to quickly mention, now is the time. Otherwise, we are at the top of the hour. So any speakers want to make a final comment on what Europe should be doing?
And I mean, it's just, I think Europe is a region that is fundamentally driven by values. And I think those values include the collaboration and the collaborative aspects in everything we do, because within Europe, the 27 member states need to collaborate. We need to find consensus. And we are very well placed to, sort of transverse that into the collaboration globally. And I think in that respect, Europe plays an extremely important role for the global South, and it's incredibly important that we keep doing that.
Yeah, no, that's some useful, valuable big picture context. Thank you for that. So yeah, no, it is time to wrap, but thank you all to the speakers. I think you've done a justice to a very big, broad, complex topic, and actually highlighted some practical steps as well, which is really important to us, because we're going to be producing an article which will summarize some of the takeaways from this. And also we will publish the recording of this webinar, so you can share that more widely as well. But thank you again for all your time and your insights, and hopefully you have each valued interacting with each other as well. So we very much appreciate it, and thank you once again for joining us. Look out for that recording and that article through Science Business going forward. So thank you all. That concludes the workshop.
Thank you, David. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.